Each spring, AFSP volunteer field advocates storm state capitol buildings across the country. They raise their voices in support of suicide prevention policies that can save lives. State Capitol Day events allow advocates to meet with legislators, share their stories, provide resources, connect with the community, and save future lives. AFSP advocates are making an impact across the country, sharing one message: suicide is preventable. By creating connections with public officials, AFSP advocates raise the volume of protections for the LGBTQ community. Resources, training, and policies for K-12 schools and higher education. Training and programming for veterans, first responders, and healthcare professionals. Mental health parity, and state suicide prevention plans and initiatives. Join the thousands of AFSP volunteer advocates across the country who are bringing hope and saving lives through advocacy. Together, we are changing the landscape of mental health and suicide prevention. Visit afsp.org/advocacy for more information and to sign up as an AFSP volunteer field advocate today.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is Taylor Chambers, and I am the Oregon Area Director with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Tonight is State Capitol Day. I'm joined here in person with Angela Perry. Angela, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, everybody. Welcome to our 4th annual State Capitol Day. We're joining you here from Tigard, and I would like to start out with a quick land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the many tribes and bands who call Oregon their ancestral territory and honor the ongoing relationship between the land, plants, animals, and people indigenous to this place we now call Oregon. We recognize the continued sovereignty of the 9 federally recognized tribes, which include the Burns Paiute Tribe, Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, the Coquille Tribe, the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua and the Siuslaw, Klamath Tribes, Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe, all who have ties to this place, and we thank them for continuing to teach us how we might all be here together.
Thank you so much for that, Angela. It is truly our pleasure to welcome you to another virtual State Capitol Day event. I know not exactly what we had hoped, but we'll get into all of the details as to why that might be, including the fact that our legislators are not currently meeting in person right now. So we are very glad to have everyone here joining us through this live platform. A couple of housekeeping items. You can hear and see us, but we cannot hear and see you. So please make sure to drop any comments into the comment of however you're viewing, if that's Facebook, on Twitch, or on YouTube. We will review those comments, and we want to take your questions. So make sure to drop those in the chat. Tonight, I'm very excited because we have an awesome panel of folks here with us that are all excited to share about why advocacy is important to them and how we can use our voice to be advocates when it comes to suicide prevention and mental health. So tonight, we're going to start by introducing our panelists in groups. I do have our first group of folks, and that's from the Oregon Alliance to Prevent Suicide. So give me just a second, and I will grab them all on here now. Welcome, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Annette to introduce herself and to introduce the Alliance.
Well, thank you, Taylor. So my name's, my name's Annette Marcus. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the policy manager with the Oregon Alliance to Prevent Suicide. And the Alliance is an organization that is in statute, actually, in Oregon to monitor and support the 5-year youth suicide intervention and prevention plan. And we have advocates, people with lived experience, young people, subject matter experts, folks from various state agencies who are members and who participate in our many committees and advisory groups. And why don't I pass the mic for introductions to Ryan and then to Jesus?
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Annette. So I'm here wearing, well, I'm not wearing any hats really, but two hats in reality. I'm the current co-chair of the Alliance, of the Oregon Alliance to Prevent Suicide. And I'm also, I work for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention on something called Project 2025, which is an initiative to reduce the rate of suicide 20% by 2025.
Hi, my name is Jesus. I am currently a part of the Alliance, as well as various other committees like the Statewide Systems of Care, their executive committee, and other subcommittees. And that's kind of the hats that I wear to this.
Awesome. Well, thank you three so much for introducing yourselves. I'm going to go ahead and remove you from the stream temporarily and bring on our folks from Lines for Life. All right, I see we have Dwight and Martin from Lines for Life. Do you both want to just take a second to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Do you also want to bring in the Youthline folks, or do you want to do them separately from us?
We will add them in just a second.
Great. I'm Dwight Holt from Lines for Life. I'm the CEO of Lines for Life. We're a nonprofit dedicated to preventing substance abuse and suicide. We host the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline for a bunch of Oregon, as well as work on prevention and policy initiatives. And I'll kick it to Martin.
Thank you, Dwight. My name is Martin. I am a drug and alcohol case manager at Lines for Life. What that in part entails is I do screenings for those who are, for instance, cited with small amounts of drugs under the new Oregon law that passed, I think, in November of 2020. And so they do a screening with me. I'm able to offer and provide resources, and then they're able to go to court, show that to the judge, get that fine dropped. I also do crisis intervention work on the suicide hotline as well. And then quickly in my spare time, I speak at DUI victim impact panels and minor and possession panels to try to prevent drinking and driving and more broadly substance use.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for those introductions. We're so appreciative of it. And now, much anticipated, we have our folks from the Youthline here today. Morgan and Jordan, I'll hand it over to you for introductions.
Hi, my name is Morgan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the assistant directors at the Youthline. Youthline is a program that our parent organization is actually Lines for Life, but we work to support youth and mental health and wellness in several different ways, whether that be outreach and education or on answering our help, support, and crisis lines. And my work that I specifically do is around training and quality assurance and then youth development for our young folks. And we are so lucky to be joined today by one of our absolutely amazing youth volunteers. So Jordan, if you wouldn't mind.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm a volunteer at Youthline. So I'm actually answering the calls, doing the texts, chats, emails, all that kind of stuff.
That's awesome. That's incredible. Well, thank you both so much for your work. Let's bring on the rest of our panelists here and we will go ahead and get started. And I should have said my kind of disclaimer for every live stream I do is the people in our lives know that we're live. The animals in our lives do not know that we are live. So we'll do our best with what we can do. But if you hear a couple of woofs in the background, you understand. I think we've all been there in the last couple of years as we've gotten used to the pandemic and working from home. So panelists, let's make sure I have everybody here added. Looks good. Thank you all again so much for taking the time to introduce yourselves. I'm so appreciative to have you all here and to make your voices heard. I think we did just get a brief introduction from everybody and on the organizations that you're here today representing. I just wanted to jump in with a general question for the group. What is advocacy? What does that mean to you? And what does that look like in practice? And Angela, I'm going to hand it over to you to get started with that.
Yeah, so advocacy for me has been a learning experience, but really learning how to share my story and use my voice to help others. The struggles that I've gone through with my own mental health and the loss of some loved ones to suicide, I'm able to turn that pain into purpose and help make some real and lasting changes. So that's kind of what advocacy is for me. So I will pass it off to whoever wants it next.
Yeah,
I'll
Martin,
take it. Thank
please
you.
jump in.
Sure. So advocacy, I mean, there's many different, adjectives that you can use to describe advocacy. So for me, I'll just kind of sum it up in one word, and I would say it's a form of empathy, or it has to start with empathy. And the reason why I say that is because in order for me to become an advocate for someone, to become their voice and to champion their cause or a cause, I first have to kind of live in their shoes on some level and understand what the needs are from their vantage point, right? And I can only do that when I really kind of get down into their world, if you will. So for instance, if I'm taking a call with someone, or when I'm taking a call with someone and they're, pouring out their heart to me, and in order for me to become their advocate, I have to identify with their experience on some level, on an empathic level. And so once I'm able to do that, both by listening to explicitly what they're telling me, but also implicitly tuning into, to what they're kind of saying, between the lines, then I'm able to ascertain what their needs are. And then I'm able to hopefully be able to provide the resources they need to have those needs met. But in doing that, I'm also affirming, the fact that they did the right thing by reaching out to us, right? Because a lot of people suffer in silence. And so just the fact that they called us and said, I'm suffering, I need help, I'm not comfortable going to my friends or family or whomever, I want to affirm that. And so hopefully in turn, that will encourage them to continue to speak out and to become their own advocate. That's the ultimate goal. But at the very least, I can, kind of be their their resource guide, and just let them know that they, that it took a lot of courage to do what they did. And I want to support that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think what I hear from both of you is how important being a voice and using your voice, or having somebody else use their voice, is when it comes to advocacy. And that's certainly something that we'll touch on more throughout tonight's panel conversation. So thank you both for those answers. That's great. I have a question about the legislative cycle, and something that I think not everybody may be aware of, but what is, I know right now we're in the middle of a short session. Can anybody explain to me what that means?
Sure, I can jump in here. This is something that was really confusing to me as I got started doing legislative work just a few years ago. Oregon is set up so that the legislature meets every year. But one of the years is what's called short session, and that's what we're in now. And that was originally designed to be used for sort of emergency measures, things that, couldn't wait for 2 years to be seen. And legislators are not allowed to introduce any more than, I believe it's 3 pieces of legislation each. The intention is for it to be very efficient and productive, 5 weeks that they come together for short session. I will say, though, that they have 250 plus bills that they're going to be looking at in this very short session. The long session is quite a few months and is a much larger span of topics that you can talk about.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things that I learned too was this year was about the difference between the short and long session. So I guess the question I would have for that is, are there mental health bills that are being introduced during this short session?
There are a number of mental health bills being introduced, I think particularly around workforce investment. I think many of us have been hearing about the Great Resignation in general in society. Well, the behavioral health world has been hit really hard by people moving out of jobs. I think that we have really are having to come to grips with the fact that many people in mental health world have not been paid very well. And so the legislature is looking at things like pay scales, programs to attract more people to the behavioral health workforce, legislation specifically to attract people of color into the mental health workforce, and basically large investments to really try and support community mental health programs and other behavioral health programs.
That's great, and such a needed area of funding, especially. Thank you for sharing that with us. So I think too, some people might feel a little bit discouraged thinking about, we're here in this short session. There's 250 bills that are being introduced. What are we doing now? What can we do now? And I want to talk a little bit and focus on what our focus is for this session and what really our priorities are for this session. So, Angela, I'm going to ask you, can we meet with our legislators during a short session?
That is a tricky question to answer. Technically, yes. However, they are completely swamped with the number of bills that they are trying to work through. With that, we are still able to communicate through email. And so for those folks who want to reach out directly to their legislators, you can go on afsp.org/advocate and put in your contact info. It links you with your local representatives, and you can just fill in why suicide prevention is important to you, and that gets sent to the legislators. And when there are bills coming up that they are working on or voting on, you can put it in. It's just a little extra in their inbox that, yes, suicide prevention does matter to me. Here in Oregon, we are lucky in that most of our legislators, if not all, care a lot about mental health and the well-being of Oregonians. And a lot of that is because of personal experience and having been touched by mental health struggles or the loss of a loved one or the struggle of a loved one. So we do have a lot of support. And so we meet with our legislators year round. It's not just a one-day thing. We work with them all year, forging relationships, and when we have a bill that we want to support, making sure that it's matched with a legislator who also supports it, who can help lead it through the process, because we're not members of Congress and we're not the voted in representatives. So they're the ones who really have to be the advocates for us to make the change. So our job in State Capitol Day really is putting faces to the legislation and legal speak, so that when someone asks, why is suicide prevention important, they can say, oh, well, I talked to Angela and she shared how she is someone who lives with mental health struggles and has lost loved ones to suicide, and she really wants to see a change. And so it's not just lines on a paper, it's a face that comes up when you're trying to explain to all the other legislators why this money needs to go and do this, because there's a lot of things that money needs to go to, and the prioritization of that money is important. And so with the faces behind it, it really helps to make a difference in what makes it through and what doesn't.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Angela. So moving on to what our advocacy priorities are for this year. And I might call on Ryan to see if he wants to share a little bit about our AFSP advocacy priorities, or at least touch on one of them. Ryan, can I put you on the spot?
I suppose so. Yeah, I think that one of the big things for us at AFSP nationwide and across states, including Oregon, is the Crisis Response Support Network. And really, we're in sort of broad strokes referring to this as 988. But basically what it is strengthening our ability in communities to respond to crises with fast and appropriate help and support. And so this looks like a couple of different things. Federally, it looks like working with legislators on rules and updating things like that. Locally, it looks like the same thing. We may not have a bill specifically aimed at that here in Oregon, but there are other ways that we're working on it. And this one in particular, this crisis response support, is one of the biggest priorities we have at AFSP right now, and which is a little it can be a little bit odd because we don't actually do at AFSP. We don't do crisis response. We lean on the National Suicide Prevention Crisis Line Network, which includes, Dwight and the team at Lines for Life. And so what we're trying to do is help sort of build that infrastructure up, whether it's, funding or technology investments, because everybody should have the full confidence that when them or a loved one is in crisis and they make that phone call, that they're going to be able to get the right help that they need at the right time. And that's so important when it comes to saving lives.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Ryan. Absolutely. And I think we'll so grateful to have folks from Lines for Life on the line. I'm going to dig into that just a little bit. In just a minute, I'll dig into that just a little bit further. But I did want to jump back over to our other priority for this advocacy session. And Angela, do you want to touch on what our other priority is for this advocacy session?
Yeah, so last year we were able to make it so that it is now law that mental health professionals have to be trained in suicide prevention. And so a big part of what we're doing in our reach out is talking to the legislators to kind of prepare them for what we're going to introduce next year in the long session. And that's expanding on that for who should be trained in suicide prevention. So focusing on getting primary care providers trained in suicide prevention and making it a requirement. For several years, it's been a recommendation. And as a recommendation, there's not really a way to track it. There's not really a way to enforce it. And so by making it an actual piece of legislation, they're required to do something. It really makes it so more people are able to get the quality help that they need. And so with the mental health professionals, when we have people in crisis, that's who we send them to go and talk to. But if they're not trained in suicide prevention, they can't really adequately help a person. They could keep them safe temporarily, but they don't necessarily know how to help them in the long run. And so looking forward, adding the primary care aspect into that, most people who have attempted suicide saw their primary care doctor within a year of their attempt. And so if we have primary care clinics trained to recognize mental health struggles and suicidal crisis, they're really going to be the first connection and hopefully keep people out of hospitals and away from attempting, because they're able to get help before that happens.
Thanks so much for that, Angela. And I'll have some follow-up questions on that too here in just a minute. I did want to just put out a reminder to those who are in the audience and are watching this wherever you may be. Feel free to ask questions too of our panelists. We want to hear from you. We did actually get a question in that I'm about to ask, so this could be your question. Make sure to get those in now. I wanted to go ahead and ask a question, and actually this came from one of our panelists. And this question is it only once a year that you get to advocate for bills? Annette, I thought you had a great response to this, so I'm going to call on you.
Great. Yeah, no, you can advocate for bills throughout the year. And in fact, a lot of the most effective advocacy happens after session when legislators aren't being bombarded from all directions with people advocating for things. And really, advocacy is kind of a long game. We need to get to know our legislators and become familiar folks to them. And I just want to say the power of having people with lived experience talk about their experiences to legislators. I can't emphasize enough how important that's been. I know I'm not moderating, but Taylor, I was wondering if I could just ask a quick question of Jesus, because I know they have such great stuff to add. Jesus, you've just shared with me some really important sort of thoughts around advocating as a young person and young adult. And I wondered if you could just speak briefly to how you got started doing that as a young person, and sort of about the power of youth voice.
Yeah, so my start in advocacy was kind of a A bumpy start, if you will. I dealt really heavily with ideation and serious of mental health struggles, and I was kind of in a down place, right? I didn't believe that there was help out there for me, but I managed to get help, and through that, I actually got connected with opportunities to do little things here and there for advocacy. I took skill classes for public speaking. I managed to get out in front of people. I think my first official kind of step in this direction was meeting with I was doing a panel for psychiatrists about how to improve care for young people in Oregon, and I have seen in my short time doing advocacy work, Oregon take huge strides to including young people and including people of marginalized communities to different places and different meetings that have actual tangible impact. And I think that's crucial because you need to have all voices at the table in order to get the accurate representation of what is needed. And I believe like the forefront of that is really involving youth, right? No one knows what youth are going through more than the youth themselves. Nothing about us without us, as they say.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Jesus. That's really insightful. And Annette, thank you for asking the question too. This is exactly the kind of conversation we want to foster and have during this panel discussion. So thank you. So I would like to move on to talking more about 988. And we have a plethora of folks joining us from Lines for Life and the Youth Line. So my question directed towards folks over there is, we talked a little bit about what 988 is, but what happens when somebody calls the crisis line now? If I'm in Oregon, what happens?
Hey, Morgan, why don't you take that? Or Jordan or Martin?
So I think it depends on the crisis line that you're calling. So in just a moment, I would love to actually hand it over to Martin to answer the question about like when you're calling the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, what that looks like. But on Youth Line, we take calls, texts, and chats. And so young folks can reach out to us in kind of whatever way feels best for them. And if it's all right, I'd love to hand it to Jordan to kind of talk about when you take those contacts, like what does that conversation look like? How do we start out the conversation talking to the amazing young people who reach out to us?
Yeah, of course. I've been really lucky to be able to talk to so many different people, having so many different conversations and kind of conversations. But our most common is text. Usually I get a text in. It usually starts with, "Hi, this is my name." And then I ask kind of, "What's going on?" or "How was your day?" Something like that to get the ball rolling. And then usually there's an answer like, "Oh, I just got a really bad grade on a test and my parents are going to be upset at me." Or sometimes it's maybe like I'm having relationship troubles with my boyfriend, girlfriend, or partner. But sometimes it can be a lot deeper, and it starts off more in depth, I guess you could say. They could be like, "My dad just hit me and I'm afraid he's going to come back," like something like that, where instantly we're doing this like check for safety. And it reads a lot different than those conversations that's like, "I got a C on the test." So that's kind of like what text is like. We do a lot of safety because we're youth talking to youth. We're not trained psychiatrists. We're not 988. We can't instantly send someone. We don't have that authority. So we ask questions like, "Are you alone right now? Do you have someone in the house you can talk to?" If there's ones regarding suicidal ideation and regarding self-harm, it's a lot of like, "Can you stay safe while we're on this call or text, chat, whatever?" So those are kind of texts. Let me know if you have any other questions. I'm kind of just spewing. And for calls, usually calls go fast. Usually someone calls in and they know what they want to talk about. That's why they call. Whereas a text reads more like a conversation between either friends or peers. Like a call, people know what they want to talk about. And usually we just jump straight to the point, keep talking, They tell me what's going on. Usually it ends with a self-care plan where we talk about what can you do tonight to stay safe. And we brainstorm together if they don't have ideas, stuff like that. But occasionally it'll end with either a supervisor taking over, or something of that sort when the call gets out of kind of our realm of abilities.
Thanks so much for that, Jordan. That's so insightful. This is as a non-youth, not knowing what it's like to reach out. It's really good to hear about what happens behind the scenes, and I think the same can be said for probably many of those joining us today. Is that we don't always know what happens when we call a number, or if we need that number, what'll happen. So thank you for sharing with us. Martin, can I turn it over to you for what happens when folks call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number?
Sure. So again, we get calls that range from, I'm having a bad day. I just, broke up with my girlfriend, or she broke up with me, and, I just don't want to live anymore, to somebody saying, I'm literally going to kill myself if I don't see someone really, really soon. And so you get the gamut from, something, and even though that first scenario or context may sound pretty alarming, if somebody says, I just don't want to live anymore, because certainly that's a very serious thing. But there's in most cases, the fact that they reached out says that they really don't want to follow through with this, right? But they just want somebody to be there for them, and to listen, and to validate, and to show some empathy and compassion for their very tough circumstance. And so even though they may start off, and I'll ask them on a scale from 1 to 10, where are you on, wanting to actually commit suicide? And they, well, I'm a 7 right now. Okay, well, it's pretty high, right? So did you want to tell me more about, why did something happen? Is this something you struggle with, mental health on a regular basis, and kind of ascertain, more context. And once they start talking and just, getting out what they need to get out, 25, 30 minutes later, they say, oh my goodness, I feel so much better. Thank you for listening. Again, I'm going to still assess for the means, to commit suicide. I have to know if there's a firearm, or, knives, or medication that they're, that they have access to. If they're there alone, like Jordan said, I need to know their level of intent, because some people say they want to wake up, they want to go to sleep and never wake up. And some people say, I'm going to go get my gun and shoot myself unless I get help. So there's a variety of things that we're looking to assess, right? A plan, the intent, the means, things like that. But then there's also several different ways we can approach that, right? In many cases, we will refer them to their county behavioral health walk-in clinic to see someone that day. If they don't feel they can be safe alone with our safety plan that we will collaborate on to construct, then I'm going to refer them there. If they don't have access or the means to get there, and they're just going to stay home, but they don't feel they can be safe, we're probably going to get a mobile crisis team from their county to come and pay them a visit. If it's a level 10 5-alarm situation, then we're gonna get 911 over there ASAP, and that'll be taken care of. We always want to, at the end of that, help create a safety plan, and we want to look in our resource guide and connect them with resources in their community where they can get ongoing long-term psychiatric help, therapy, counseling. There are many online support groups that I'll have texted. I can't text them myself, but I'll put it into the chat. One of the supervisors can text online services free. They're totally free. You can get peer support. You can get group therapy. You can get professional support through these online portals. Totally awesome. That's one good thing that's come out of the pandemic. And we just want to offer them as much as they can possibly stand in the way of resources. And not to be too long-winded here, but it's just critical that you listen with an empathic ear, and you validate their feelings, and you encourage them to continue to speak up about their mental health. And once you kind of, again, affirm that, I think it just encourages them to continue to feel safe and comfortable with reaching out, for help, either with us or with other, agencies or resources in the community. So, there's multiple levels of kind of what we're assessing for and where we're looking to go with each call, depending on, how severe it is. But everything starts with empathy, validation, support, encouragement.
One of the things that I want to add that was a little bit surprising to me learning about just how the whole thing works is not only when you call the national line, the 1-800-87, talk, like the whole number, if you can remember it, it will get you to the closest call center based on your area code.
Yeah.
And one of the upgrades with 988 that is required, that we need funding for, is that it would, instead of getting it based on your area code, it would geolocate you kind of like 911 does. If you have a Portland phone number and you're in Florida and you call 911, you're going to get to that Florida dispatcher. But that doesn't work yet with the suicide prevention crisis line. It's based on your area code. And so that's a huge investment that we're working on, because as Martin mentioned, part of what happens during these calls is people get connected with local resources, local information. And if you are not doing well and you just happen to move to Portland from like Minnesota, and you haven't changed your phone number yet, that's not the best setup right now to be connected to a call line in Minnesota, which is one of the huge upgrades that, like, why at AFSP we push for more funding for that, like, support mechanism for the upgrade of, and changing the line number and all of the upgrades that go along with that.
And I think for me, because I've worked at NSPL centers for 15 years, and that is something that is so exciting for me, because while certainly we can find resources for folks in Minnesota, right, if we're in Oregon, to be able to actually talk to someone local, I think it changes the conversation a little bit. So while we're able to support now, and it's amazing to be able to have this extra step and extra piece of it, I think is just so, so exciting. And so thank you, Ryan, for bringing that up.
Thanks so much. Now I'm going to drop some legislative jargon out there, but did House Bill 2417 change anything when it came to what we're doing now to answer the Lifeline calls? And for those who are not familiar, House Bill 2417, well, does anybody want to speak to House Bill 2417? Yeah, please, Dwight.
Yeah, I can jump in. And so House Bill 2417, correct me if I'm misremembering y'all, but is the bill that helps begin set up the infrastructure for the 988 world. And so 988, just so you know, 988 is live on most cell phones already. So if you pick up your phone and dial 988, and you're welcome to do this, although not all at once, it will likely ring down the hall from my office. Well, not literally. It'll ring with one of our call counselors, whether it's Martin or one of his colleagues at Lines for Life. But building the actual infrastructure to handle what we expect to be a whole bunch more people calling is what 2417 is intended to set up. And really importantly, I think this is actually pretty cool. Thanks to advocacy from folks like AFSP, the federal government and the state of Oregon, instead of just saying, oh, 988, we're going to get a lot more calls, we need more Martins answering calls. Instead of that, it's a much more comprehensive approach. The federal government and the state of Oregon, the Oregon Health Authority, have really embraced 988 as an opportunity to create a much more comprehensive response to crisis. So 2417 not only kind of begins with some investment in helping us hire more call counselors, helping us establish an infrastructure to do chat and text for adults that's much bigger than anything we've ever done before. We've always kind of dabbled in that, except with the Youth Line. But in addition to that call center work, there is a significant investment in mobile response and and there will be a significant investment in crisis stabilization. Because the idea behind 988 is to have a much more integrated system where you have kind of three legs of the stool. Yes, the call center, which handles, like 95, 97% of the people who call us, we don't need mobile response, emergency services, or crisis stabilization. But for that 3 to 5% who need that stepped up service, we want it to be the right kind of service at the right time, delivered in the right way with peers whenever possible. And 24/17 starts to build that out.
Could
Did I
not
get
have
that
said it
right,
better
Ryan?
myself. That's perfect. Thank you so much for that. That's very helpful. And that was only enacted last year. So that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's right. And not to pander, but the OHA folks, it's Rusha Grinstead, for those of you keeping track, has been working night and day to try and get this stood up. They just filed a grant application with the feds for very significant funding for the next steps, and we're really excited about it. There's been a crisis system advisory work group, Seesaw they call it, that has worked very hard to bring voices of lived experience and communities of color into helping assess what the policy looks like. It's made great policy changes, frankly. The committee has sent stuff to us that's been very helpful and constructive in how we think about it. So we're pretty excited about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. That's great. And that's good to know, and good background too. So this year, when it comes to 988, and I did see a couple of questions come into the chat. I promise we're going to get to those. I'm going to wrap up some questions on 988, and then we're going to dive into some questions from the chat too. So keep them coming. We want to see them. But this year, are we advocating for anything related to 988?
Yes. Like with most stuff, it costs money. So we are always asking for more money to help push the work forward. There's money that needs to go to staff the lines. There's money that needs to go for the behind the scenes, like how phones work and make phones know where you are and all of that stuff. So it's just funding needed for all of that. And it is a very expensive process, very complicated process. But for 988, it is federally mandated. And so it is going to happen this summer in the entire country. So no matter where you are, when you call 988, it will go to the crisis line. So for folks like me who struggle with numbers, remembering 1-800-273-8255 is really, really hard to do when I'm not in a mental health crisis. So when you're struggling and actually need that number, to remember 988 is a whole lot easier. And so the way that the budgets work and the behind the scenes and all of that stuff, it is a very complicated process. But yeah, we're mostly asking for increased funding, continued funding, so that we can grow the network.
And Annette, were there any specific bills regarding 988 funding that were introduced this session?
Oh my gosh, Dwight is going to be more on this than I am. I don't know that there has been a specific. I don't think there. Okay, thank you, Dwight. I feel reassured that you're shaking your head at
You're all
me.
good, Annette.
Okay,
There's
yes.
nothing, go ahead.
Yeah, there's just a ton of work happening. And I think this is one of the things I would say that I've learned about advocacy is that there's legislative advocacy, which is really important. And but there's also a lot of work between legislative sessions, especially when it's something complicated that's going to involve big system changes. And the more that we do that kind of ongoing work, the better. And there's actually lots and lots of opportunities for people to engage during the legislative session and after the legislative session with groups like AFSP and the Oregon Alliance, et cetera.
I think that's a great point. And I think, part of having the short session is it makes it really tough to introduce new legislation right now. So part of our work this session is to thank our legislators for last session and the work that they did. And also to let them know, hey, funding might be coming up. We might put an ask out there next legislative session too, if we don't see any movement on this, or if we realized, once things go into effect this summer, we do still need more funding from our state government. That's when legislation might be introduced to as next session. So something to keep an eye on is that might be an ask in the future too. Just because it's not an ask this session from a bill perspective doesn't mean it won't come up in the future too. And so our voices are still critical there. I'm going to jump over to some comments from the audience. We have a question here from Megan Sears Caldwell. Question says, as a mom with 3 kids in school, I am concerned with what seems to be the lack of social emotional support in our school system, especially amidst a pandemic and the aftermath. Are there any bills coming up specifically addressing supporting our youth? And then a follow-up comment to that, specifically within our schools. Annette, I hate to pick on you here, but I know that you wanted a chance to address this question, so I'm going to call on you again.
Well, Megan, I was just so glad to see your question. I think that, supporting social emotional support is absolutely essential and really is part of suicide prevention. I think the good news in Oregon is that I feel like there's been kind of a big awakening of people about this issue. And last session, actually, there was very significant legislation passed to support young people in the schools and to promote social emotional learning. In particular, I mentioned something called Addie's Act, which was a suicide prevention bill that requires schools to have a suicide prevention intervention plan. The Alliance's Schools Committee is working in many different ways at looking at how do we promote social emotional intelligence. And so there's been programs like Sources of Strength that have gotten funded really through the advocacy of folks like you around this table. And that program is a really wonderful in-school program of building kind of a community of peers that are promoting positive messages and helping people think about how do you lean in to help someone when they're struggling? How do you ask for help when you need help? I don't know if others want to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add, Annette, that the schools committee with the Alliance is made up of some of the most amazing individuals that are, meeting with the Oregon Health Authority, with the Oregon Department of Education, on a very regular basis to make sure that we are really thinking about what we have to measure, what we need to incorporate, what should be included, how are we going to define success, what do we do if things don't go the right way, or a school isn't set up. And so that's, like we were talking about earlier, some of the advocacy that happens in between sessions or in different places is that the Alliance has members of the public that are doing this on a regular basis, and there's definitely room to get involved with that as well. And I'd also, it's a plug for AFSP, but I think that there's possibly some things that could take place in terms of just like a presentation about mental health at schools and things like that are always options that, that maybe go and they coincide with some of that advocacy work that's definitely taking place as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think that's a really great reminder too, is that it's not just all advocacy, right? It's not just all one end of anything. And so we, hand in hand, while we're doing advocacy work, are also out in the community doing prevention education programs. So if you know somebody who could benefit from a prevention education program, let us know. We want to hear from you, and we would love to be the resource for you while we wait for legislation to catch up to where you want us to be too. But that's something that we offer as part of our organization, and so we would be happy to do that for you.
Hey, can I chime in to mention a great partnership we have? Thanks to advocacy from groups like AFSP and Basic Rights Oregon, a couple of years ago, as part of the Student Success Act, the legislature both passed Addie's Act, which requires suicide prevention planning in all schools in Oregon, but also set up an infrastructure to support schools for suicide prevention and wellness initiatives. We call it the School Suicide Prevention and Wellness Initiative, SSPW. And the way it works is Lines for Life has 4 or 5 people actually who are teamed up with education service districts regionally. There are 16 ESDs. The ESDs are like super school districts. So the Willamette ESD is Lynn, Marion, and Yamhill counties, I think. And it supports all of those school districts. And I think they do everything from, they buy all the toilet paper off for all of them because it's cheaper if they buy it all together. I mean, I just made that up, but you get the point. And those folks know how to make change at the school level. Lines for Life folks know how to do community engagement and prevention work around suicide. Together, it's been a remarkable partnership that's the product of the kind of advocacy that the AFSP volunteers are so good at, and is an essential component now where it's being really woven into becoming an essential part of the fabric of support for students in schools, that we've got this great high-level partnership with both school change expertise and suicide prevention expertise. We're working hand in hand.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, we're still taking questions in the chat. I see one more that we have not yet gotten to. I promise we will get to that question. We're going to address part of that in just a moment. So I'm saving that for just a second from now. But before we get into that question and a couple of other questions for our panel, I wondered if anybody wanted to speak to House Bill 2315.
I'm pausing because I think there's several of us here that could speak to that. Should I jump in? Yes,
Let's
jump
do it.
in. Okay. So House Bill 2315 is actually, I can't remember if it was Angela or Taylor, but one of you referred to it earlier when you were talking about that there's now a requirement for therapists, counselors, and other people in the behavioral health workforce to get some continuing education in suicide intervention, assessment, and treatment. And I have to say, I was really shocked as I learned over time how little training most counselors had in the area of suicide prevention, and just the many, many stories that we heard very powerfully about folks who had gone to see therapists, and basically when they talked about being suicidal, either had that dismissed or had been turned away. And obviously that's very disturbing when so much of the work that we're all doing is trying to get people to ask help and reach out for help. So we are really proud of, actually every single organization here at this table worked on this, of getting 2315 passed. And we actually have a strategy in place where we believe also that healthcare professionals, especially primary care professionals, ought to also have good skills around suicide assessment and intervention. And so in our next long session, we are looking to introduce legislation to require that kind of training for health professionals.
Thank you for that. And one of the things that was like really surprising for me with this 2315, we can celebrate it and it was great, but it took like 3 sessions to get, we had one iteration introduced and it kind of didn't go anywhere. We worked on it again, and then it still got, cut down to be something that was not as broad as we had hoped it was, or that it was when it was introduced. And so I think that's the part that really, with advocacy, legislation, and new bills, new laws, and things like that, that the long game is a real thing. And I find it to be one of the more frustrating things about advocacy, that it just takes so long sometimes.
Absolutely. I think we could probably all echo that feeling at least a little bit, that yes, it is certainly a long process. And I know when I was thinking about our short session and thinking about our priorities, it didn't occur to me that, oh, well, we're going to also talk about what we're talking about for next long session and what we're going to do after this session. It's always future looking too. And it's very forward thinking about what our priorities are and what they will be. So on that note, what is our real goal when it comes to the House Bill 2315 this year? Angela, do you want to talk about what we plan to talk to legislators about when it comes to that bill?
Yeah, so with our conversation, it's essentially thanking them for helping us to make it so that it's now a requirement for mental health professionals to be trained in suicide prevention. Because before that bill, they didn't have to be. A lot of times they weren't trained at all. I know Martin commented that before he started with Lines for Life, he had never had suicide prevention training. So as someone who struggles with mental health issues, to go to a provider who's supposed to help me and them not know how to help me, it makes it harder to go and seek help in the future. For those who live with suicidal ideations and chronic mental health struggles, it's hard to reach out at all. Your brain is constantly telling you that you're alone, no one cares. And so when you finally do get up the courage to go and ask for help, and you have someone say, oh, well, here's this medicine, or go and make an appointment with this person 6 months down the road, because that's how long the waiting lists are, you're not getting help. So if you have the mental health professionals, and hopefully in the future, primary care doctors, emergency room doctors, nurses, anyone and everyone essentially should at least know a little bit about suicide prevention. We already know there aren't enough mental health professionals. And so if we're getting primary care doctors and nurses and stuff like that trained in suicide prevention, we're able to help before it becomes a crisis situation. And in the long run, that will definitely help save lives. I know for myself, I've been struggling since I was a very young child, and it wasn't until I was 35 that someone actually asked me if I was actively suicidal. That's not saying that I had never struggled, that doctors didn't try and help me before, but they didn't know the wording to ask the questions that I needed to hear. And especially as a child, I didn't have the language to vocalize what my struggles were. And so if you have people trained at the Youth Line, at Lines for Life, at primary care clinics to know what questions to ask and to know when it's appropriate to ask the same question worded 20 different ways. If you know that there's something wrong and they're saying no, 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 it could literally be a technicality in the way that you're phrasing a question. And so by requiring the trainings to teach people how to safely have those conversations and then how to provide follow-up care, it will definitely save lives.
I just have to say here, Angela testified on this bill so powerfully during the last session. And she was just an amazing example of using her real experience really thoughtfully, telling the story of the struggle, but also providing some story of hope, of saying, and once I was working with professionals who could help me, my life turned around. And I think that's one of the other lessons, is it's important to be very real about how hard things are, but also to offer legislators a path forward for a better outcome.
I think that's an important reminder too. And there are paths forward. We know that there are different answers to the questions that we're asking and different possible solutions to the needs that we have. So that's a really good reminder too, is the call to action there is super important. So we've talked a lot about what our advocacy priorities are for this session and what it looks like to use our voices a little bit. But I think now would be a great time to dive in a little bit deeper on a question that Sherry asked. I'll bring up her comment here. What is it like to actually meet with legislators? What should someone expect? Is it very intimidating? So let's do a quick panelist raise of hands. Who here has met with a legislator before? Oh, good. So we have lots of perspectives here to hear from. Jesus, I want to call on you for this. Can you start to answer Sherry's question for us?
Absolutely. So for some context, I have social anxiety, so everything's pretty intimidating to me. But I have met with legislators in, I think, 2 different ways. I have spoken to them through email, and I've spoken to them in person. For me personally, email was more intimidating because computers are scary. But once you kind of get past the fact that it's a person in a position of power for sure, but it's also a person who 9 times out of 10 are actually trying to do good. And knowing what you want to say and knowing what you want to advocate for when you speak to them makes the process a lot easier. I wouldn't say that they're intimidating to meet with. I think a lot of the times we psych ourselves out before we get to the place where we can meet them.
Jordan, did you want to elaborate on that at all? I saw that you've also had the chance to meet with a legislator.
Yeah, I got to meet with Ron Wyden to talk about youth mental health and how important it is, especially in bills. And he is the chair of the Finance Committee, so he has a lot of say there and really wants to bring about some change there. Yes, it was very scary at first. I was really nervous, but as soon as he started talking, it just felt like a conversation. And they are just real people. So it's just someone to talk to about something that you both care about. And then Senator Wyden also shared some personal testimony about how his brother dealt with schizophrenia for a long time. And that's why Senator Wyden is so passionate about bringing about change to like how we deal with and talk about mental health. So once we kind of connected on that level, because you always have common ground with one of these legislators if you're talking to them. So once we established that common ground, it felt like just a productive conversation.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a pretty powerful that it goes a long way to show when somebody has a personal connection to the work that we do, their voice can go a long way when they're an elected official too. So that's pretty powerful. And we know too, so many people have a connection to our cause. It affects all of us in so many different ways, whether that being we've personally struggled, our loved one of ours has struggled, we know someone who struggled, or we've lost a loved one to suicide. All of these are ways that impact our lives forever. And using that as testimony can be extremely powerful. Extremely powerful. So thank you for sharing that too. And it's interesting to hear too on the senator.
Taylor, that's if I could just say that's such a good point about stories, because like whenever we've kind of followed up with any elected officials, usually what they remember is not the bills we talked about, but it's the stories of the people they met with. And so, if you're feeling like you're nervous about meeting with someone, I think the tips that have been shared are good, but you don't have to be an expert in the bills or the laws or the process even. Is like, for me, it's just, if you have a story, share your story, and they'll remember it, just like so many people have. Angela, I don't know how many elected officials I've talked to that'll be like, oh, AFSP, oh, Angela, yeah, I talked to Angela. She's got like an amazing story.
That's that absolutely is our Angela. No, I meet people all the time who say the same thing, and it's so powerful to hear your story, and thank you for taking time to share it with us and for making your voice heard in that way.
So one thing with that, I'd never done advocacy stuff before 4 years ago. I didn't know the first thing about the advocacy process. Literally, my experience was the Schoolhouse Rock video, how to make a law. That's what I knew. And I was asked to go to represent Oregon at our federal advocacy forum in Washington, D.C. And that was really my first time sharing my story out loud to anyone really who would listen. Obviously, people close to me have known what I've gone through over the last decade plus, but I had never shared it publicly. And so to go in and not only talk about the losses that I've had with friends and family members, but also to share what I've been through as someone who has lived through it. It's been very healing for me. I was completely terrified before. Now I can talk about it most of the time. like it's just normal conversation. One thing with sharing your story, though, if you're having a bad day, you don't have to share all of your story. You can pick and choose. So sometimes, like if I have a meeting, but I am burned out emotionally, it's easier for me to talk about my losses instead of talking about my personal struggle. Sometimes it's the opposite if I'm close to those lost days or birthdays of loved ones who aren't here anymore. It's easier to talk about my personal struggle than it is of the loss. And so what you share and what you talk about is completely up to you, and you do not have to share more than what you're comfortable with. And even if you just go in to meet with the legislator and say, hey, I have a connection to suicide. I'm not quite ready to talk about it, but just know it's close to my heart. A lot, like I've gone into meetings where they've shared their connection instead of me sharing mine. And I can tell you most of our elected officials have been touched by either personal mental health struggles or people that they care about. And it's not just the legislators, it's their office staff as well. So when we do the meetings, it's not always with the representatives. Sometimes, like for the short session especially, they are busy, they're in meetings, they're in committee meetings, stuff like that. But they still want to meet with you, still want to hear your story. We'll talk to one of their staff members, and then that staff member will pass it along to the elected official. And that was kind of how I first realized that my story could make a difference. I was in DC and had a meeting scheduled with one of Senator Wyden's staffers. And one of the first meetings that I went to, I think it was my second time sharing my story out loud, and it was with a staffer who had just lost someone the week before. And that staffer listened to my story and then shared their story, and then went and walked me down the hall of the Capitol building to pull the senator out of a meeting to talk to me in the hallway. And that hallway conversation led to me being called by the senator's office staff to go do a press conference with him, talking about the need for adequate health care. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just sharing my truth and my life. And it impacts a lot of people, and a lot of people have struggled, whether it's the same reasons. It doesn't matter. If you've struggled, you can empathize with someone else who has struggled. Or if you've lost someone, you can empathize with someone else who's lost someone. So I like to say AFSP family, and it's a family that none of us ever wanted to be a part of. None of us ever asked to be connected to suicide or mental health struggles, but so many of us are. And by being willing to share that part of ourselves that's so often done alone and tucked away and too scary to talk about, it takes the scariness factor away. When you start talking about it, you're taking the power back, and it helps to empower others to do the same thing when you're willing to share your truth.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Angela. I'm just blown away by you listening to you talk about advocacy. And sharing your story too goes such a long way. So thank you for sharing that with all of us here today. And I think that brings up a couple of really good points that I'd just like to touch on. We have all talked a lot about sharing our story, and it's important to share your story safely. So you want to make sure that you're in a good place, like Angela had said, with your mental health and wherever you are in your grief process, if that's part of your life right now. But make sure you're in a safe place to share your story. You don't want to be in a place where it's going to be traumatic for you to share, or it's going to be hard for the other person to hear. We have some really great safe speaking guidelines that are on our website that everybody can find, that talk about how to share your story safely. And it's something that we always provide to folks when they go into meetings with legislators. You don't have to overthink that either. And it's okay to be vulnerable and to be honest in these conversations, as much as you're comfortable being vulnerable and honest about that. So I I thought it might be helpful to see an example video of a legislative meeting. I'm going to go ahead and bring that up. If anybody has any other questions for our panelists, take time now to drop those in the chat while we're watching this example legislative meeting.
Want to make a difference for suicide prevention and mental health? Want to get the attention of your public officials? Want to save lives through advocacy? Here's how. Public officials listen to their constituents, and that's you. Advocating for suicide prevention is easier than you think. So get ready to take action, advocate, and save lives.
When advocating at the state and local level, and sometimes at the federal level too, you may have the opportunity to meet with your public officials. Today, we're meeting with Council Member David Grasso.
Get organized. Have the materials you plan to share ready. You must be on time to your meeting. Early is better. Decide who is leading the meeting before you get there. Practice sharing your story out loud. You might want to do this in front of a mirror or with a trusted friend or family member. Keep your story to 2 to 3 sentences, 30 seconds or less. Decide what you are asking for and how you are going to ask for it. Collect yourself before the meeting. Calm those butterflies, and now you're ready to advocate. Introduce yourself. Thank the council member for meeting with your group.
Council Member, it's great to see you again. Taylor and I are here today representing the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention for our first ever advocacy day here in the district. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Ask how much time for this visit.
How much time do we have today?
Thank the council member for previous support, if applicable.
It just means so much to me, both personally and professionally, that you introduced the Youth Suicide Prevention and School Climate Survey Act back in 2016 to require educator training and school policies in suicide prevention. Thank you so much for your leadership, for being a true champion on this issue.
Share your personal story. Ask other group members to briefly share their stories.
I've been with the foundation for about 10 years now, since losing my brother to suicide. He was in high school when he died, so it just means so much to me.
So I'm also a field advocate, and I have a number of family and friends who struggle with their mental health and with finding the necessary resources.
Share the AFSP national and state fact sheets and underscore that suicide is preventable. State there are steps the council member can take to support prevention efforts and share the talking points and legislative needs.
As you can see here, suicide is the 15th leading cause of death in Washington, D.C., the 10th leading cause in the country, but we know it is preventable.
Which brings us to our 2 asks of you today. The first bill would require regular training for health professionals in suicide assessment, treatment, and management.
And the second bill we'd like you to support would address suicide prevention on college and university campuses. We've also included some language for a resolution making September Suicide Prevention Month, if you'd be interested in introducing that this year.
That's great. I really appreciate the advocacy, and obviously I'll look closely at your materials. In fact, I'll be happy to put you in touch with my staff as well to make sure that they have your contact information and you have theirs to work on these bills as well as perhaps introduce the resolution. So thank you.
Request to take a picture with a council member if time. Give folder to the council member, shake hands, and be sure to say thank you for their time. Write down notes from your meeting so you can report back to the AFSP Public Policy Office. So that wasn't so hard, was it? Your AFSP advocacy does make a difference, whether it's on the local, state, or federal level. Start planning your meetings with your public officials now. The AFSP Public Policy Office is here to help you along the way.
Wow. So as you see from this video, it's pretty easy. It doesn't have to be a long, detailed conversation. And as I was chatting with Angelo as we got ready for today, so often many of the conversations that we have with legislators are not 30-minute in-depth going into all of the analysis of the bills, but it really is that 3 minutes in the hallway. It's that 5 minutes that they have between the other meetings that they have to go to that can make all of the difference. And I thought what was really great in this example is you saw somebody share their story in a little bit more depth, and you saw somebody just say something a little bit more standard, like, I have had friends that have been touched by this. So I think that just goes to show that you really can run the gambit and run the spectrum of what things can look like in the legislative meeting. I did have, let's see, it looks like we have one more question that I see came in from our audience. This will probably be our last question that we have time for this evening, but I'll go ahead and bring this up. I will try to bring it up. So this says, thank you for your hard work with state and federal elected officials to educate, oh no, I can't see all the questions, to educate and advocate for suicide prevention. Watching the news this evening, I was reminded of the importance of working with local, city, and county elected officials too. Just in the Portland metro area, $164 million is being distributed as part of the American Rescue Plan Act, most of which is going to be spent on the homeless community. What is AFSP doing to prevent suicide in the homeless population? And is there an, oh no, well, unfortunately, I can't see the last half of the question, but we might be able to have some folks address part of the first part of your question. I'm so sorry about that. We're limited a little bit by the platform there. So what is AFSP doing to prevent suicide in the homeless population? Ryan or Angela, do either of you want to touch on that at all?
There's always more to do. But I know with what we can do locally, we work very closely with whichever groups and community groups, businesses who want kind of overview trainings, education on suicide prevention education. We have Talk Saves Lives. We have a program called Supporting Those at Risk. We have a couple for high school and college age teens, and we have one for younger kids. And so really it's just helping to have conversations around mental health and suicide prevention. But yeah, like I said, there's always more to do. I know there are a few grants from that money that, not necessarily that one specifically, but we have been working to apply some of that grant funding to some of the different programs that we do here locally. But also we work a lot with research. So a lot of the funding that AFSP has goes to research for different treatments, different programs to help those who are at risk. A lot of that could in the long run help with the homeless population. It helps with veteran population, LGBT plus community, kind of the most at-risk groups. AFSP has research projects going to see how we can better help. And that's been one of the kind of coolest parts that I've seen from AFSP funding is just coming up with the different ways that you can help people. So whether it's medications or different types of therapy, different stuff like that, like there's always more to do. And the more you learn, the more questions you have. And we have researchers across the country who are funded by AFSP to look into those questions and see how we can better help. And that research is leading all of our prevention education programs. It's also leading our loss and healing programs for how to help folks who have lost someone. Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit more about what all we do on Project 2025 in that arena?
Yeah, I think you answered it well, Angela, in that it's we focus on getting the right people the best help when they need it. And I can't recall specific initiatives for homeless populations. But Angela, you did a great job. I appreciate that.
Thank you both for that. And I'll look to follow up with the rest of that question tomorrow too, just so I can make sure that you get the answers. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened that we can't see the full question, but I'm so appreciative of your comments too. And I just want to acknowledge that, as you pointed out in that comment, it is important to meet with our local officials too. So today's day is really about meeting with our state legislators, but it is just as important to have these conversations at the local level that we have at the state and federal level. Before we let our incredible group of panelists go this evening, I want to give the opportunity to our panelists if there's anything else that you want to add to this conversation. We are so, so, so grateful for you all.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I kind of just wanted to add a little bit to the question that was asked previously. I'm not sure too much about AFSP. Sorry, I'm not good with acronyms or names. But I know there's a lot of organizations currently on more of like the startup level that are focusing entirely on the houseless population. During kind of the ending of my job as a peer support specialist, there was one that we were working with called, it's like Emergency Housing Something Initiative. And their entire thing was working with young people that are currently experiencing houselessness or are at an immediate risk of experiencing houselessness. And they worked as a direct pipeline. They had peer support specialists in-house and worked as a direct pipeline with housing and mental health services. So there are stuff like that popping up. And I know that it's becoming a lot more of an important topic. It always should have been, but it's becoming a lot more prominent now. And I just wanted to make sure that that was, out there.
Thanks, Jesus. Martin, did you have something you wanted to add as well?
Just really briefly, when you guys were talking about the importance of requiring every clinician practitioner to be trained in suicide prevention and assessment, as a substance abuse counselor, like I said, I had never been trained on suicide prevention. But we know that there is a great overlap between mental health disorders and substance use or substance abuse, because a lot of people try to self-medicate, with substances to deal with their mental disorders and struggles. And so we also know that for someone who is already struggling mentally, when you introduce substances, the risk of suicidal ideation increases, right? We know that factually, statistically. So I think it's imperative that for not just substance abuse counselors, but all mental health practitioners who are encountering people who are dealing with some emotional, mental distress, be trained to assess and look for the implicit cues that will alert them that there's something deeper here that needs to be addressed around suicidal ideation. A lot of times, and I know we're wrapping up, a lot of times people won't explicitly say they're thinking about suicide. I can go through a 30-minute call with someone and because I'm human, may forget to assess, intent, means, plan, future orientation. And then I'll ask, well, are you thinking of suicide? And they say, well, actually, I have been. And here I went through a whole 30-minute call without having a presence of mind to ask them. So that needs to be something that is that we are trained on and that we're looking for. So I just want to add this, very, very important. I pray that I hope that everyone goes out, calls their legislators, demand that this bill pass, and that everybody has the training that they need.
Thank you so much for that, Martin. Yeah, please, Jordan.
Yeah, that's so true. It's so important. I wanted to add on to what you were talking about, the bill regarding general practitioners having this suicide prevention awareness training. So for youth, we don't always get access to mental health care. We have our school counselors, but they're very, very busy. And like a lot of schools have school psychologists. But at my school, most kids don't even know we have one that you can actually go talk to and like actually have a conversation regarding mental health, not just regarding what class you want to drop next semester. But a lot of kids, their only form of care is the general practitioner once a year or once every other year for sports physicals or whatever. And they ask you a question. They have a little checklist if you're under 18, I think, and it asks how, like, about depression, anxiety, feelings of sadness prolonged over the past 2 weeks, stuff like that. If these general practitioners don't have this training, then they're missing out on an opportunity. Like, these kids have one opportunity a year to share their struggles, or like maybe they don't explicitly say that they're contemplating suicide, but if they're dancing around the question and their general practitioner never even asks, that is an opportunity that's just completely missed. So I think that's so important for youth especially.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you for sharing that perspective. It's huge.
Yeah, thank you guys.
I guess just a final comment that I'd love to make is that, oddly, I had not been involved with suicide prevention before 4 years ago. And working in the field of suicide prevention has given me more hope than any other kind of work I've ever done. And it's for a couple of different reasons. One, it's a place where we value authentic experience, and people like when Jesus said, you know, I deal with social anxiety. What a powerful thing that is, just to model for people that I'm going to talk about the real deal of what it's like for me to get through life. But also because we've been able to make a huge difference in the last 5 years in Oregon. We had, I think, almost zero investment from general funds, and had gotten up to $10 million invested in general funds during that 5-year period. There still needs to be a lot more than that, but we have been able to impact change, and there are a lot of these support programs happening now in a way that they really weren't before, and it's really been due to the advocacy of folks like you.
Thanks so much for that, Annette. Any other final thoughts from our panelists?
I'll just say you matter. I mean, it's amazing the impact you can have when you look at the accomplishments we've had with investment in behavioral health last year, with some very specific cutting edge suicide prevention legislation. It's because of the work that AFSP advocates are doing. So we thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
I guess a final little hope piece. Advocacy can seem like a daunting task, and a lot of times it is, but people are out there doing it. We can all put in our amount of effort, whatever we feel comfortable with, whatever we have the capacity for, because especially right now, things are really hard for everyone. But the difference is being made. It might be gradual. It might not even be noticeable until you pull yourself back from, the area you've been working in, but the difference is being made, and we can continue to make a difference as long as, we continue to speak up.
Completely agreed. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, on that note, I'll say thank you again to all of our panelists for joining us. This has been an absolutely incredible conversation. I've learned so much from all of you, and I just want to say thank you so much for joining us this evening. And to those out there in the audience, we are so grateful for you tuning in during your Monday evening. I know after work sometimes can be a bit of a drag, but we're so grateful for you guys tuning in and for hearing what our panelists had to say today to make our voices heard. We're going to leave you today with just a video on next steps and follow-up that you can take if you'd like to make your voice heard, and what it means to advocate with us. So I'll leave you with that video. Thank you again, panelists, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.